He left her in the damp country estate, convinced she was too unrefined, too awkward to stand beside him in London's glittering ballrooms. So, the Duke brought a flawless, polished replacement to parade before high society. He forgot one crucial detail, though. His wife wasn't some fragile, weeping violet waiting to wither in the dark. She owned the very ground he danced on. Tonight, she's coming to claim her territory. Settle in for a scandal that tore the aristocracy apart. Rain hammered the leaded glass of Oakhaven Manor, sounding like a handful of gravel thrown by an angry child. Alvin fastened the final brass button of his traveling coat. The wool felt heavy, suffocating in the drafty foyer that smelled perpetually of wet hounds and old ash. He avoided the gilt-frame mirror by the door. He avoided the doorway to the library, too, where he knew she was waiting. He didn't want to look at her. It wasn't hatred that kept his gaze averted. It was a rotting, hollow guilt that tasted faintly of bile at the back of his throat. "You are determined to take the morning train, then?" Her voice came from the shadows of the hall. It lacked the musical lilt prized in drawing rooms. Beverly spoke the way a mason laid bricks, flat, heavy, and intended to endure. Alvin stopped, his hand hovering over his leather gloves. He turned slowly. Beverly leaned against the doorframe, supporting her weight on a thick ashwood cane. She wore practical tweed, the color of wet mud, tightly buttoned up to her chin. The high collar was a deliberate choice, though it did little to hide the puckered, shiny expanse of burn scar that crept up the left side of her jaw. It was a brutal souvenir from a house fire years ago, a tragedy that had also crushed her left hip beneath a falling beam. She stood unevenly. One shoulder dipped lower than the other. Her knuckles, wrapped tightly around the carved handle of her cane, were white and rough from tending her own rose gardens. "The debates in the Lords are pressing," Alvin lied, his voice sounding entirely too thin in the cavernous hall. "And the season is demanding." The physicians agreed the damp air of the country is better for your joints. The London townhouse is practically built on a swamp. The stairs alone would be agony. He watched her mud-brown eyes. They didn't soften. They didn't well with tears. That was the most infuriating thing about his wife. She never gave him the satisfaction of playing the victim. She just looked at him, dissecting his cowardice with the precision of a butcher. "You mean the stairs at the Wellington estate, Alvin," Beverly said. The tip of her cane scraped against the stone floor, a harsh, dragging sound. "And the gaslight. The gaslight is terribly unforgiving to a crippled woman with a ruined face." Alvin flinched. "Beverly, please, do not put words in my mouth. It is purely a matter of logistics. I have arranged for Caroline to act as hostess at the townhouse, for the optics of the thing. A duke cannot entertain a parlor full of foreign dignitaries without a lady to pour the tea." "Optics." She rolled the word around in her mouth like a bad piece of fruit. "A very clean word for a very dirty habit." "She is my cousin. She knows the societal steps. It is a practical arrangement." He grabbed his gloves, yanking the stiff leather over his fingers with unnecessary force. His pulse hammered against his stiff, starched collar. He was a duke. He owned 30,000 acres. Yet, standing before this woman whose dowry had saved his family from absolute ruin, he felt like a scolded stable boy. "Caroline is a widow with expensive tastes and a desperate need for a patron," Beverly stated, completely devoid of inflection. "She wears too much jasmine water and laughs loudly at jokes she does not understand. But she has 2 working legs and a symmetrical face. I suppose that is all the aristocracy requires to pour tea." "I am doing this for you," Alvin snapped, his temper finally fracturing. The sudden shout echoed off the high ceiling. "Do you think I enjoy the whispers? Do you enjoy them? The stares when you drag that piece of wood across the dance floor? They pity me, Beverly, and they pity you. I am sparing us both the humiliation." Silence rushed back into the room, heavier than before. The rain outside seemed to double its efforts, lashing furiously against the glass. Beverly didn't yell back. She simply shifted her weight. Her bad leg gave a subtle shudder under the tweed skirt. "Humiliation," she repeated softly. "I survived a burning roof collapsing on my body, Alvin. I pulled my sister from the ashes with my bare hands. Do you truly believe the whispers of men who wear corsets and powder their faces hold the power to humiliate me?" She turned, a slow, agonizing pivot on her good heel. "Go to London, Alvin. Take Caroline. Drink your champagne. Let them look at you and envy your flawless companion." She paused, glancing back over her lowered shoulder. "Just remember whose money paid for the carriage that takes you there." The heavy oak door of the library clicked shut behind her. Alvin stood alone in the foyer. The smell of wet hounds suddenly made him nauseous. He grabbed his hat, shoved it onto his head, and walked out into the storm. The carriage was waiting. The leather seats were cold and stiff. As the wheels lurched forward, churning up the thick country mud, Alvin closed his eyes. He hated the mud. He hated the endless, suffocating damp. But most of all, he hated the immense, suffocating wave of relief that washed over him as Oakhaven Manor disappeared from view. He was free. For a few weeks, he could pretend he was a whole man, married to a whole life. London smelled of roasted chestnuts, horse manure, and wet coal dust. It was a sharp, aggressive scent that coated the back of the throat, entirely different from the heavy, rotting vegetation of the country. 3 days had passed. Alvin sat in the velvet-lined carriage beside Lady Caroline, the wheels clicking a rapid metallic rhythm over the cobblestones of Mayfair. Caroline was, by every societal metric, perfect. She wore a gown of spun-sugar pink silk that rustled with every shallow breath she took. Her blonde hair was pinned in an immaculate, gravity-defying sculpture. She smelled intensely of jasmine water and French face powder, a cloying sweetness that completely masked the underlying scent of the city. Her gloved hand rested lightly on Alvin's forearm, a deliberate pressure meant to signify intimacy without crossing the line into vulgarity. "You are terribly quiet tonight, Alvin," Caroline murmured, tilting her head. Her smile was practiced, revealing perfectly straight, perfectly white teeth. "My apologies. The debates in the chamber were exhausting," he murmured, offering a tight smile. It was a lie. He hadn't attended the debates. He had spent the afternoon in his study, drinking a glass of scotch and staring at a ledger book filled with Beverly's neat, aggressive handwriting. The carriage lurched to a halt outside the Earl of Harrington's estate. The street was jammed with identical black lacquered carriages, a glittering procession of London's elite. Footmen barked orders. Horses snorted in the cold night air, their breath rising in thick white plumes. As they stepped out, the sensory assault of the ballroom hit Alvin like a physical blow. The heat was the first thing. Hundreds of gas lamps hissed softly along the walls, burning up the oxygen and raising the temperature to an uncomfortable, stifling degree. The air was thick with the scent of melting wax, roasted meats from the buffet, and the sour tang of nervous sweat masked by heavy colognes. The noise was a solid wall of sound, a frantic string quartet battling against the roar of 300 voices engaged in superficial chatter. Alvin offered his arm. Caroline took it, her chin lifting as they entered the grand hall. Instantly, heads turned. Alvin felt the familiar prickle of eyes upon him, but for the first time in years the gaze wasn't laced with pity or morbid curiosity. It was pure, unadulterated envy. Caroline looked radiant under the gaslight. She moved with a fluid, gliding grace, laughing softly as they descended the shallow marble steps. "Hawkhurst, my good man," a voice boomed over the din. Lord Repton, a man whose waistline was entirely at odds with his vanity, waddled toward them, a glass of amber liquid sloshing in his hand. "Splendid to see you. And Lady Caroline, you are a vision, as always." "You are too kind, Lord Repton," Caroline practically purred, dipping into a flawless curtsy. Repton leaned closer to Alvin, his breath smelling strongly of stale cigar smoke and gin. "I must say, old boy, I was surprised to see your name on the guest list. I heard the Ah, the Duchess was indisposed. Alvin's jaw tightened. The stiff collar of his shirt suddenly felt like a garrote. "Beverly finds the city air disagreeable," he said smoothly, a rehearsed line slipping easily from his tongue. "The physicians recommended she remain at Oakhaven. Caroline has graciously agreed to assist me with my social obligations." "Graciously indeed," Repton chuckled, his eyes sliding over Caroline's silk-clad shoulders with the subtlety of a starving dog looking at a butcher's window. "Well, a man has needs, eh? Social needs, of course." Alvin smiled. It felt like his face was cracking. He extracted them from the conversation as quickly as politeness allowed, steering Caroline toward the perimeter of the room. For the next 2 hours, the pattern repeated. The approving nods, the sly winks from the older peers, the fluttering fans of the young debutantes. Alvin drank 3 glasses of champagne in quick succession. The bubbles tasted like copper and acid against his dry tongue. He looked at Caroline. She was engaged in a spirited conversation with a young naval officer about the latest Italian opera. Her laughter rang out, high, clear, and entirely empty. It was a sound designed to please, a sound with no roots in actual joy. Alvin suddenly felt profoundly, intensely hollow. He leaned against a marble pillar, the cold stone seeping through his broadcloth jacket. He watched the swirling dancers, a blur of jewel tones and black tailcoats. This was what he had wanted. This was the pinnacle of his society. He was here. He was accepted. He was admired. Yet an image flashed unbidden in his mind. Beverly sitting by the fire at Oakhaven, her ruined leg propped on a velvet stool, reading an agronomy journal and occasionally letting out a short, rough snort of laughter at some absurd claim a farmer made about turnip yields. There was more life, more jagged, breathing reality in that single snort than in this entire suffocating room. Caroline turned back to him, her eyes wide and glittering. "Alvin, they are playing a waltz. Shall we?" He looked at her hand, extended toward him. It was a delicate thing, pale and unblemished. "Of course," he said, pushing off the pillar. He took her hand. It felt cold. Midnight approached, bringing with it a frantic desperation among the guests. The heat in the ballroom had peaked, causing powder to streak down aristocratic noses and wilting the carnations pinned to lapels. The string quartet, sweating heavily in their heavy woolen coats, launched into a vigorous, breathless waltz. The floor was a chaotic mass of spinning bodies. Alvin moved through the steps mechanically. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Caroline was light in his arms, practically anticipating his movements. It was like dancing with a ghost. Then a sound cut through the music. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a crash. It was a heavy, groaning shriek of brass and wood. The massive double mahogany doors at the top of the grand staircase, usually guarded by 4 rigid footmen and only opened for royalty, were forced outward. A rush of cold night air slammed into the ballroom, sweeping down the stairs and causing the hundreds of gas lamps to flicker wildly. Long, panicked shadows danced across the ceiling. The music faltered. The cellist dragged his bow across the strings in a discordant squeal. The violinist lowered his instrument. The waltz collapsed into a messy, confused dwindling of notes. Alvin stopped, spinning around. The dancers around him were doing the same, a collective wave of murmurs rising from the floor. At the top of the stairs, a footman was stumbling backward, his face pale, hands raised in a useless gesture of apology to the room. He had clearly tried to stop whoever was entering and had failed miserably. A figure stepped into the threshold. Alvin's stomach plummeted, a physical drop that left him dizzy. His lungs forgot how to pull in air. It was Beverly. She had not undergone some miraculous fairy tale transformation. She had not found a dress to hide her flaws or a veil to cover her face. If anything, she had amplified them. She wore a gown of heavy, unapologetic velvet in a shade of midnight blue so dark it swallowed the light. It wasn't a delicate ball gown. It was tailored with a severe military cut. the bodice tightly structured, the sleeves long and close-fitting. It was armor. Her hair was pulled back ruthlessly from her face, secured with heavy silver pins, exposing the shiny puckered scar on her jaw to the glaring gaslight. In her right hand, she held her cane. It wasn't the plain ashwood one she used at home. This was a thick shaft of black walnut, capped with a heavy, snarling silver lion's head. The room fell into a dead, suffocating silence. The only sound was the hissing of the gas lamps. Beverly looked down at the sea of faces. She didn't look nervous. She didn't look ashamed. She looked at the glittering aristocracy of London with the flat, heavy gaze of an auditor reviewing a very disappointing ledger. She took a step forward. Her heavy boot hit the top marble stair. Then she brought the cane down. Clack. The sound echoed off the vaulted ceiling like a gunshot. She dragged her ruined left leg down to the next step. Thud. She stepped with the right. The cane struck again. Clack. Drag. Thud. The descent was slow, agonizingly slow. It forced every single person in the room to watch her uneven, laborious progress. They couldn't look away. The sheer audacity of it paralyzed them. The whispers began, starting at the back of the room like dry leaves caught in a cold wind. "Good God, what is that?" A woman near Alvin gasped. "Is that Hawkhurst's creature?" Another muttered. Caroline's fingers dug painfully into Alvin's arm. "Alvin!" she hissed, her voice trembling. "Alvin, what is she doing here? You said she was in the country." Alvin couldn't speak. He was rooted to the parquet floor, staring at his wife. He felt a sudden, terrifying urge to run, to push his way through the crowd and flee into the street. The humiliation he had feared in the country was nothing compared to this. This was an execution. Beverly reached the bottom of the stairs. She paused, adjusting her grip on the silver lion's head. The cold scent of the storm outside still clung to her heavy velvet dress, cutting sharply through the cloying perfume of the ballroom. She locked eyes with Alvin across the floor. She began to walk toward him. The crowd parted. They didn't do it out of respect. They scrambled out of her way with a mixture of shock and instinctual avoidance, as if she were carrying a plague. The path opened instantly, a wide, empty aisle stretching directly from the staircase to where Alvin stood, frozen with Caroline clinging to his arm. Clack. Drag. Thud. She was halfway across the room. Her breathing was visible, slightly elevated from the exertion of the stairs. The scar on her face caught the light, an intricate map of survived violence. Alvin's hands began to shake. He realized in a moment of blinding clarity that she hadn't come to make a scene. She hadn't come to cry or beg him to come home. She had come to hunt him down. She stopped 3 feet away. Up close, the contrast was devastating. Caroline looked like a spun sugar confection, terrified of melting. Beverly looked like a monolith. "Alvin?" she said. Her raspy baritone voice didn't waver. It didn't need to be loud to command the silent room. Alvin swallowed dryly. "Beverly, what are you doing here?" Beverly reached into the pocket hidden in the folds of her velvet skirt. The crowd collectively held its breath, half expecting her to pull a pistol. Instead, she withdrew a small leather-bound ledger. She held it out to him. Her hand was steady, the knuckles rough and unpowdered. "You took the wrong book," Beverly said, her tone utterly conversational, as if they were standing in their own library rather than the center of the London season. "You took the harvest projections instead of the domestic accounts. If you attempt to pay your Mayfair tailors and Lady Caroline's modiste with the winter feed budget, the estate will bounce the draft by Tuesday." Alvin stared at the little brown book. His face burned with a heat hotter than the gas lamps. He reached out with a trembling hand and took it. "You traveled all this way, in the storm, for a ledger?" he whispered, his voice cracking. Beverly shifted her weight, leaning heavily on the cane. Her mud-brown eyes flicked briefly to Caroline, taking in the pale, trembling woman, the pink silk, the frantic grip on Alvin's arm. Then her gaze snapped back to Alvin, pinning him in place. No, Beverly said, lowering her voice just a fraction so only the three of them could hear the iron beneath the words. I decided that if you are going to wear my family's crest on your hand and spend my family's money to dress your cousin in silk to pretend you aren't married to a monster, you will look the monster in the eye while you do it. Caroline released a breath that sounded remarkably like a punctured tire. Her fingers tightened on Alvin's bicep, her manicured nails digging through the heavy broadcloth of his evening coat. The silence in the ballroom had stretched past shock into something venomous. Alvin stood paralyzed, the small leather ledger burning a brand into his palm. Beverly did not wait for an apology. She did not wait for an explanation or a sudden tearful declaration of devotion. Having delivered her blow with the precision of a guillotine, she turned. The slow, agonizing pivot of her ruined hip was more deliberate this time. She adjusted her grip on the silver lion's head. Clack. She took her first step back toward the grand staircase. Well, Lord Repton's gin-soaked voice boomed, shattering the quiet. He let out a nervous, braying laugh. I say, Alvin, your accountant is fiercely dedicated. A smattering of polite, terrified titters rippled through the nearest guests. Caroline seized the opening with desperate, clawing instinct. She threw her head back, forcing a bright, ringing laugh that echoed harshly against the marble walls. Alvin, really? Caroline gasped, waving her feather fan to dispel the thick, suffocating tension. You must tell the estate managers to use the post. How absurd. The poor woman must be entirely delirious from the journey. She tugged sharply at his arm. Come, the musicians are waiting. Let us resume. Alvin looked at Caroline. He looked at her perfectly powdered nose, devoid of shine despite the stifling heat of the room. He looked at her flawless, unblemished jawline, her pale throat, the symmetrical, pretty features that had cost him absolutely nothing to acquire. For 3 days he had used her as a shield to deflect the pity of his peers. Now, standing under the hissing gaslight, he realized she wasn't a shield at all. She was a glass window, and everyone in the room was looking right through her, straight at him. They weren't looking at Beverly with pity anymore. They were looking at Alvin with contempt. He was the Duke who had hidden his wealthy, scarred wife in the mud to parade a hired, pretty face in the Capitol. Beverly had just stripped him naked in front of the House of Lords. Alvin! Caroline's voice dropped its musical pitch, becoming a frantic hiss. Alvin, move! People are staring! He felt sick. The heavy scent of jasmine water rising from Caroline's cleavage suddenly smelled like rot. It smelled like cowardice. Let go of me, Alvin said. His voice was entirely flat. It wasn't a request. Caroline's smile froze, turning brittle and ugly. Pardon? Let go of my arm, Caroline. He pulled his limb away with a sharp, violent jerk. The movement was so abrupt that Caroline stumbled back a half step, her pink silk skirt catching on a gentleman's cane behind her. Alvin didn't look back to see if she caught her balance. He shoved the leather ledger into his coat pocket. He turned his back on Lord Repton, on the staring debutantes, and on the hissing gas lamps. He walked toward the grand staircase. His long legs ate up the distance, his polished boots thudding against the parquet floor. He passed through the parted crowd, feeling the sharp, stinging slap of their whispers against his cheeks. Running after her. Did you see the scar? Absolute humiliation. He reached the stairs. Beverly was only a quarter of the way up. Her ascent was vastly more difficult than her descent. She had to plant the cane, brace her entire upper body, and drag her bad leg up to meet the good one. Her shoulders were shaking under the heavy blue velvet. Alvin took the stairs 2 at a time. He caught up to her just as she reached the top landing, the cold draft from the open double doors whipping around them. Beverly, he snapped, his voice tight. She didn't stop. She pushed through the heavy doors and out into the biting London night. Alvin followed her onto the portico. The rain had intensified, coming down in heavy diagonal sheets. The street was a chaotic mess of black umbrellas and shouting coachmen trying to control spooked horses. The wet cobblestones gleamed like slick oil under the street lamps. "Beverly, stop!" Alvin grabbed her elbow. She turned, yanking her arm out of his grasp with surprising strength. The silver lion's head of her cane slammed onto the wet stone, splashing muddy water onto Alvin's tailored trousers. "Do not handle me in public, Alvin," she growled. The adrenaline of the ballroom was fading, leaving her voice raw and breathless. Rain instantly began to plaster her hair to her forehead, the heavy drops tracking down the shiny ridges of her scarred cheek. "You lost that privilege when you left me in the country with the hounds." "You came here to humiliate me," he accused, his chest heaving. The cold air burned his lungs. "I came here to drop off a ledger," she replied smoothly, though a tremor of pure exhaustion betrayed her. "Your humiliation was entirely self-inflicted. I merely provided the lighting." She turned away, signaling a battered hired hackney cab waiting at the edge of the queue. It wasn't the Hawkhurst carriage with the velvet seats and the family crest. It was a filthy square box smelling of wet horse and cheap tobacco. "You are not taking a street cab," Alvin said, horrified. He stepped forward to intercept her. "Where is the estate carriage?" "I didn't bring it. The suspension is terrible for my back." She reached the cab. The driver, a hunched man with a dripping wool cap, stared at them with bored indifference. Beverly reached for the door handle. She pulled it open, but as she tried to hoist herself up the high step, her ruined hip gave out. It wasn't a dramatic collapse. It was a sudden, ugly buckling. She let out a sharp, involuntary hiss of pain, her knuckles turning bone white on the cane as she caught herself against the dirty wheel hub. The heavy velvet skirt dragged in the gutter, soaking up the filthy London water. Instinct overrode Alvin's bruised ego. He stepped in, grabbing her waist with both hands. He felt the rigid steel boning of her corset, and beneath it, the tense, shaking muscles of her back. He practically lifted her, shoving her awkwardly onto the dark leather seat of the cab. Before she could protest, Alvin climbed in after her and slammed the door shut. "Drive to the Hawkhurst townhouse on Grosvenor Square," Alvin barked through the small wooden partition. "Alvin, get out," Beverly demanded from the dark corner of the carriage. The driver cracked his whip, and the hackney lurched forward into the storm. Alvin was thrown back against the opposite bench. The carriage smelled strongly of wet straw, stale ale, and the sharp ozone of the rain. "I'm not getting out," Alvin said. He wiped a stream of rainwater from his face, his breathing harsh in the confined space. "We're going to finish this." The interior of the cab was pitch black, illuminated only by the rhythmic, strobe-like flashes of passing street lamps. The light would slice through the rain-streaked windows, briefly illuminating Beverly's face before plunging them back into darkness. She had retreated to the farthest corner of the cracked leather bench. She was not sitting upright. The rigid military posture she had held in the ballroom was gone. She was slumped against the vibrating wooden wall of the cab, her head thrown back, eyes tightly closed. Alvin watched her. His anger, previously a hot, bright flame, was suddenly suffocated by the heavy, damp air of the carriage. "Your leg," Alvin said quietly. The rattling of the wooden wheels over the cobblestones almost drowned out his voice. "It is nothing." Her voice was strained, thinner than paper. "You are in agony." I said, "It is nothing." The carriage hit a deep rut in the street. The heavy wooden box slammed downward. Beverly couldn't suppress the groan that tore out of her throat. She curled inward, her gloved hands pressing desperately against her left hip, trying to hold the joint together through the heavy velvet. Alvin leaned forward. The space between them was barely 2 feet, but it felt like a chasm. He reached out, his hand hovering uncertainly over her knee in the dark. "Let me help," he muttered. "Don't touch me." She swatted his hand away. Her strike was weak, uncoordinated. "Just give me a minute. The cold dampens the nerve. It just takes a minute." Alvin pulled his hand back, resting his elbows on his knees. He stared at his boots. The polished leather was splattered with mud. "Why did you really come, Beverly?" Alvin asked. The anger was entirely gone now, replaced by a hollow, gnawing ache in his chest. It wasn't the ledger. The estate has enough reserves to cover a few mistaken drafts. You rode an 8-hour train with a hip that tortures you in the damp. You walked into a ballroom of vipers. Why? A passing street lamp illuminated the cab. Beverly had opened her eyes. She was looking at him, her expression stripped of its usual cynical armor. The pain had worn her down to the studs. "Because I was tired of waiting for the ghost to leave my house," she said. The cab plunged back into darkness. The rain hammered against the roof. Alvin frowned, entirely lost. "What ghost?" "You," she said, her voice dropping to a rough whisper. "You wander the halls of Oakhaven, Alvin. You sit in the library, you drink your port, you tally the accounts. But you aren't there. You haven't been there since the fire." Alvin swallowed hard. The back of his throat tasted like copper. "Before the fire," Beverly continued, her breath hitching slightly as the cab took a sharp turn, "we were partners. We rode the estate lines together. We fought over the crop rotations. You used to look at me." "I look at you," Alvin protested weakly. "You look past me," she corrected, a bitter edge returning to her tone. "Or you look at my bank accounts. Or you look at the floor. You look everywhere except at the ruin on my face and the drag of my leg. You think you are being polite. You think you are sparing my feelings." She let out a dry, humorless laugh that ended in a wince. "Your politeness is a slow, suffocating poison, Alvin. When you left for London, when you told me you were taking Caroline because the gaslight was unforgiving." She paused. In the dark, Alvin heard the rustle of heavy fabric as she shifted her weight, trying to find relief. "It didn't break my heart. It just made me incredibly, violently angry. Angry that I married a man so fragile he requires a pretty doll to face a room full of fops." Alvin flinched. The words were precise, surgical strikes. They hit dead center. "I'm not fragile," Alvin argued, his voice rising defensively. "Then why did you run?" she shot back. "Why did you pack your trunks in the dead of night and flee to Mayfair? You ran because looking at me reminds you that the world is chaotic and cruel, and that no amount of aristocratic blood can stop a burning beam from falling. You prefer Caroline because she is safe. She's an empty room. There's nothing to trip over." The cab slowed, the horses' hooves clopping loudly as they turned onto the smoother pavement of Grosvenor Square. Alvin looked out the window. The grand townhouses stood like silent sentinels in the rain, their wrought iron gates locked against the filth of the city. He owned one of the largest houses on the square. It was entirely hollow inside. He looked back at Beverly. The street lamps were more frequent here, casting a steady amber glow over her. Her hair had largely escaped its severe pins, hanging in damp, heavy strands around her face. The scar was fully exposed, a testament to violence. But beneath it, her jaw was set. Her eyes, dark and relentless, met his. She wasn't a fragile, weeping violet. She was an absolute force of nature, and he had been terrified of her. "You are right," Alvin said. The admission scraped its way out of his throat, feeling like swallowed glass. Beverly blinked, clearly surprised by the lack of a fight. "I was terrified," Alvin continued, leaning closer, closing the distance between their benches. He didn't try to touch her again, but he kept his gaze locked on hers. "When they pulled you from the ashes, when the physicians told me you might not survive the fever, I couldn't breathe. And when you did survive, and you woke up, and you were different. You were so angry, so fiercely, stubbornly determined to walk again, to manage the estate, to refuse pity." He scrubbed a hand over his face, smearing rainwater and soot across his cheek. "I didn't know how to stand beside a woman like that," he confessed softly. "I was raised to protect women who swooned at the sight of a spider. I didn't know how to be a husband to a woman who pulled her own sister from a burning house. I felt useless, so I cowered behind politeness, and then I cowered behind Caroline." The hackney cab jolted to a complete stop outside the tall, imposing iron gates of the Hawkhurst townhouse. The driver knocked heavily on the wooden partition. Beverly stared at Alvin. The anger in her eyes had fractured, leaving behind something exhausted and raw. "I don't need a protector, Alvin," she said, her voice dropping to a low, gravelly timbre. "I need a husband who doesn't flinch when the lights are turned up." Before Alvin could reply, the cab door was yanked open by his own wet, frantic footman, spilling the cold streetlight over them. Beverly grabbed her silver lion cane, gritted her teeth against the pain in her hip, and prepared to drag herself out into the storm once again. Rain lashed down in heavy, blinding sheets, turning the cobblestones of Grosvenor Square into a treacherous, slick mirror. The footman stood frozen under a large black umbrella, his mouth slightly ajar, water dripping from the brim of his top hat onto his stiff collar. He had expected the Duke to return with Lady Caroline. He had not expected the Duke to arrive in a hired street box, accompanied by a terrifying woman in soaked velvet. Alvin stepped out of the hackney cab first. His expensive broadcloth evening coat was ruined, heavy with muddy water and smelling intensely of the wet straw from the cab's floorboards. He ignored the footman entirely. He turned back to the open door of the cab. Beverly was attempting to maneuver herself toward the edge of the seat. Every subtle shift of her hips translated into a sharp, involuntary tightening of her jaw. The heavy blue velvet, now thoroughly soaked at the hem, acted like a lead weight dragging her down. She reached out, planting the silver lion's head of her cane onto the wet step of the carriage, preparing to launch herself outward. Alvin did not reach in to pick her up. He understood now. Lifting her was an act of erasure. It was a way of pretending her struggle didn't exist by bypassing it entirely. Instead, he planted his muddy boots firmly on the slick pavement. He squared his shoulders, braced his stance, and extended his right forearm. He held it rigid, a solid bar of muscle and bone. "Use me," Alvin said. The rain immediately plastered his hair to his forehead, running into his eyes. He didn't blink. Beverly paused, halfway out of the dark interior. She looked at his offered arm. The street lamp cast a harsh, flickering light across her face, highlighting the exhaustion pulling at the corners of her mouth and the deep, dark circles under her mud-brown eyes. For a fraction of a second, Alvin thought she was going to refuse, to stubbornly drag herself out and risk collapsing in the gutter just to prove a point. Then she let out a slow, shaky breath. She bypassed his hand, wrapping her bare, unpowdered fingers securely around his bicep. Her grip was startlingly strong, the grip of a woman who wrestled with rose bushes and stubborn horses. She leaned her weight into him. Alvin gritted his teeth against the sudden, sharp pressure. He held firm. With a heavy grunt of effort, Beverly leveraged herself out of the cab. Her bad leg hit the pavement. The impact sent a visible shudder up her spine, but she remained upright. Together, they turned toward the towering, imposing facade of the townhouse. The front steps, 6 massive slabs of imported Italian marble, loomed ahead like a fortress wall. "Slowly," Alvin murmured, keeping his voice strictly between them. Clack. The cane hit the first marble step. She pulled herself up, her fingers digging painfully into Alvin's arm. He adjusted his stride, abandoning the smooth, gliding walk of an aristocrat. He mirrored her uneven rhythm. He became her counterbalance. It was an ugly, ungraceful ascent. There was no poetry in it. It was just 2 people, soaked to the bone, fighting gravity and exhaustion on wet stone. The heavy oak door swung open before they reached the top landing. Mr. Higgins, the ancient, perpetually disapproving butler, stood in the threshold. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of them, a microscopic break in his professional facade. "Your Grace," Higgins stammered, stepping back into the warm, beeswax-scented foyer. We were not informed of the Duchess's arrival. Alvin practically hauled Beverly over the threshold. The warmth of the house hit them like a physical wall, making the wet clothes suddenly feel suffocating. "Clearly," Alvin snapped, his voice sharp and commanding, dropping the quiet vulnerability he had shown in the cab. He was the Duke of Hawkhurst again, but the frantic, hollow energy was gone, replaced by a cold, heavy authority. "Pay the hackney driver, double his fare, then lock the gates. We are entirely unavailable." "But your Grace?" Lady Caroline. "Lady Caroline will likely return in Lord Repton's carriage, or she will find her own way," Alvin interrupted smoothly, shedding his sodden, ruined evening coat and dropping it unceremoniously onto the pristine marble floor. "When she arrives, you will inform her that her trunks are to be packed by morning. She will be returning to her own residence." Higgins blinked, staring at the ruined coat on the floor. "Very good, Your Grace." "Shall I have Mrs. Higgins prepare the blue guest room for her Grace?" Alvin turned his head. He looked at Beverly. She was leaning heavily on her cane, a puddle of dirty water forming around her heavy velvet skirts. She looked utterly spent, a soldier after a grueling campaign. "No," Alvin said, holding Beverly's gaze. "Her Grace will take the master suite, have a fire lit immediately, and bring a bottle of the Scottish whiskey to the sitting room. Do not bother with glasses." He offered his arm to Beverly again. This time she didn't hesitate. She took it, and they began the long, agonizing walk down the grand hallway, leaving a trail of dirty water and shocked servants in their wake. The master suite smelled faintly of camphor and cold ash. It was a cavernous, masculine room, dominated by dark mahogany furniture and heavy crimson drapery. It was a room designed for a man who lived alone. A young, terrified housemaid had just managed to coax a roaring fire to life in the massive marble hearth before fleeing at their approach. The flames cast long, dancing shadows across the patterned wallpaper. Beverly unhooked her arm from Alvin's and hobbled toward the fire. The moment she stopped moving, the adrenaline that had carried her through the ballroom and the hackney cab completely evaporated. Her shoulders slumped. The silver lion cane trembled in her grip. "Sit down," Alvin said, pulling a heavy leather armchair closer to the hearth. She didn't argue. She turned, her bad hip catching abruptly. She hissed, practically collapsing backward into the leather. The heavy velvet dress bunched up around her, smoking slightly as the wet hem neared the heat of the fire. Alvin walked to the small table holding a silver tray and the bottle of whiskey Higgins had hastily procured. He didn't bother with the crystal tumblers. He uncorked the bottle, walked over to the armchair, and handed it directly to her. Beverly took it. She didn't sip. She took a long, unapologetic swallow directly from the neck of the bottle. She closed her eyes, a sharp cough escaping her lips as the alcohol burned down her throat. "Better?" Alvin asked, leaning against the heavy wooden mantelpiece. "Slightly," she rasped, handing the bottle back to him. He took a drink himself. The whiskey was rough, tasting of peat and smoke. It cut through the cold dampness still lingering in his chest. He set the bottle on the mantel. The silence between them stretched. It wasn't the suffocating, tense silence of the country estate. It was a heavy, exhausted quiet. Alvin looked at her, really looked at her. Her hair was a disaster, half pulled from its silver pins hanging in damp, dark strings. The powder she had likely applied to dull the shine of her scar had washed away in the rain, leaving the puckered, angry flesh completely exposed. The midnight blue velvet dress, which had looked like armor in the ballroom, now looked like a trap. It was tightly tailored, heavily boned, and completely soaked. "You are going to freeze in that," Alvin observed quietly. Beverly looked down at herself. She raised her left hand, clumsily attempting to reach the row of tiny hook-and-eye closures that ran tightly down the back of her bodice. Her fingers, stiff from the cold and the death grip she had maintained on her cane, fumbled uselessly against the thick fabric. She let out a frustrated, angry sigh, dropping her hand to her lap. "My maid is in Sussex. I told her not to come." Alvin didn't hesitate. He pushed off the mantelpiece and stepped behind her chair. "Lean forward," he instructed. Beverly stiffened. "Alvin, I can manage. Just give me a moment to thaw." "Do not be an idiot, Beverly. You cannot reach them, and your fingers are numb. Lean forward." For a long, tense moment, she didn't move. She was incredibly protective of her physical space, fiercely guarding the vulnerability of her broken body. Letting someone, especially the husband who had fled because of her injuries, undress her was a massive concession. Slowly, agonizingly, she leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. Alvin looked down at the back of her dress. The closures were intricate, tiny metal hooks buried in thick, wet velvet. He reached out. His hands were large, entirely unsuited for such delicate work, but he forced himself to be precise. He found the top hook at the nape of her neck. He popped it free. The small metallic click sounded loud in the quiet room. He moved down to the next one, and the next. As the dress loosened, the heavy fabric fell away from her neck and shoulders. The damage from the fire had not stopped at her jawline. The puckered, shiny expanse of scar tissue crept down the left side of her neck, disappearing beneath the edge of her corset. It was a brutal map of survival. A month ago, Alvin would have averted his eyes. He would have felt a surge of nausea, followed instantly by a wave of crushing, paralyzing guilt. Tonight, he forced himself to look. He stared directly at the twisted flesh. He noted the way it moved when she breathed, tighter and less yielding than undamaged skin. He didn't feel pity. He felt a sudden, profound awe. She had burned. She had literally been crushed and burned, and she had dragged herself out of the ashes to run an estate and humiliate him in a ballroom. "There," Alvin said softly, undoing the final hook at the base of her spine. Beverly shivered as the cold air hit her skin. She grabbed the front of the heavy velvet bodice, holding it against herself as she sat back up. "Thank you," she muttered, not looking at him. Alvin stepped around the chair, pulling a thick woolen blanket from the edge of the massive mahogany bed. He unfolded it and draped it over her shoulders, covering the unhooked dress and the damp skin. He knelt on the rug in front of her. The heat of the fire radiated against his face. "So," Alvin said, keeping his voice level, "tomorrow." Beverly pulled the woolen blanket tighter around herself. Her dark eyes met his. The exhaustion was still there, but the cynical armor had slipped back into place. "Tomorrow, London will talk of nothing else. Lady Caroline will likely weep to anyone who will listen, claiming I attacked her with my cane. Lord Repton will embellish the story until I am 10 feet tall and breathing fire." "Let them talk," Alvin said flatly. Beverly raised an eyebrow, a bold sentiment from a man who fled to the city to avoid their whispers. "I am done running," he stated. He didn't look away. He didn't flinch. He stayed kneeling on the floor, perfectly level with her gaze. "You told me I haven't been at Oakhaven since the fire. You were right. I was waiting for the woman I married to come back, the woman who danced until dawn and didn't have a terrible temper." Beverly's jaw tightened. A flash of familiar, defensive anger sparked in her eyes. "But she burned, Beverly," Alvin continued, his voice dropping to a rough, raw whisper. "She burned in that house, and I have spent years mourning her, while completely ignoring the terrifying, magnificent creature that crawled out of the wreckage." He reached out. He didn't hover this time. He took her right hand, the hand scarred by roses, not by fire, and held it firmly in his own. "I'm not going to hide you," Alvin said, the words heavy and deliberate. "And I am not going to let you hide me in the ledgers. Tomorrow, you will wear something appropriately terrifying. We will take the Hawkhurst carriage, and we will drive through Hyde Park at the height of the promenade." Beverly stared at him. The firelight flickered across her face, softening the harsh edges of her scars. For the first time since he had met her in the hallway at Oakhaven, she looked genuinely, completely surprised. "You want to parade me in Hyde Park?" she asked, a low, skeptical note in her raspy voice. "No," Alvin corrected, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through the grim set of his mouth. "I want to parade myself next to you. I want them to see exactly whose territory I am standing on." Morning broke over London with the subtlety of a shattered glass. Harsh, pale sunlight sliced through the narrow gap in the crimson drapery of the master suite, illuminating dust motes that hung suspended in the stagnant air. Alvin woke in the leather armchair. His spine felt fused together, and his neck protested violently as he lifted his head. The fire had died hours ago, leaving behind a sharp, acrid smell of charred wood and old soot. On the massive mahogany bed, Beverly was already awake. She sat propped against a mountain of pillows, a silver breakfast tray balanced precariously across her lap. She wore a severe, high-collared morning gown of dark slate gray. She was methodically buttering a piece of toast, scraping the knife against the crust with a repetitive grating sound that vibrated right behind Alvin's temples. "Caroline left at dawn," Beverly stated. She did not look up from her toast. Alvin rubbed his eyes, his mouth tasting of stale peat smoke and leftover whiskey. "I know. I heard the trunks." The departure had not been quiet. Caroline had spent an hour directing footmen in frantic, hissing whispers that carried perfectly up the grand staircase. The heavy, thudding rhythm of wooden trunks being dragged over marble had echoed through the townhouse, accompanied by the cloying, fading scent of jasmine water. "She took the silver tea service from the morning room," Beverly added, taking a small, deliberate bite. "I assume you consider it severance pay." But Alvin let out a low, rough exhale that might have been a laugh if his head didn't ache so badly. "Let her have it. The teapot always poured unevenly anyway." He pushed himself out of the armchair. His joints popped. The ruined evening coat was still on the floor downstairs, so he remained in his rumpled trousers and the wrinkled, collarless linen shirt he had slept in. He walked to the window and pulled the heavy curtain back. Hyde Park was visible in the distance, a sprawling expanse of vibrant, rain-washed green cutting through the gray stone of the city. The storm had scoured the sky completely bare. It was a brilliant, unforgivingly bright afternoon. "The carriage is ordered for 2:00, Alvin said, looking out at the glittering carriages already beginning to circle the park. "An open landau." Beverly stopped chewing. The silver butter knife hovered over the porcelain plate. "An open carriage, in broad daylight." "Yes." "Alvin," she warned, a sudden tight edge creeping back into her baritone voice. "Do not make promises in the dark that you cannot stomach in the sun." He turned away from the window. The bright light washed over her, highlighting the raised, uneven texture of her scarred cheek and the stark, rigid posture she held to protect her spine. She looked terrifying. She looked real. "I have instructed Higgins to have the horses polished until they reflect the sun," Alvin said evenly. "Wear a hat if you must, Beverly, but we are not putting the roof up." 3 hours later, the Hawkhurst carriage joined the slow, grinding parade of Rotten Row. The sensory shift from the quiet townhouse to the park was absolute. The air smelled of damp earth, crushed grass, and the rich, oily scent of expensive leather harnesses warming in the sun. The noise was a constant low roar, the crunch of gravel beneath iron-rimmed wheels, the snorting of high-bred geldings, and the incessant buzzing hum of aristocratic gossip. Beverly sat rigidly on the plush velvet seat beside him. She wore a tailored jacket of deep forest green wool that offered no concession to the spring weather. She had forgone a veil. Her hat was a modest felt piece, pinned securely, offering only a slight brim. She gripped her silver lion cane with both hands, the knuckles white and prominent. As their carriage merged into the main thoroughfare, the effect was immediate. It started as a physical ripple in the crowd. Heads snapped around. Parasols were lowered. The buzzing hum of conversation abruptly died, replaced by a dense, suffocating silence that followed the carriage like a physical weight. Alvin felt his stomach hollow out. The instinct to shrink, to look away, to hide behind the high sides of the landau screamed in his blood. He felt the phantom weight of Caroline's light, perfumed hand on his arm, a ghost of the easy shield he had relied on for days. He looked at Beverly. She was staring straight ahead. Her jaw was locked so tightly, a muscle twitched near the edge of her scar. She was bracing for the blow. She expected him to falter. Alvin deliberately shifted his weight. He slid closer to her on the bench, closing the polite 6 inches of space society demanded. He reached over and placed his gloved hand directly over hers, pinning her white-knuckled grip against the silver lion's head. Beverly flinched, a sharp intake of breath hissing through her teeth. She shot him a sideways glance, her mud-brown eyes wide with shock. "Look at them," Alvin murmured, keeping his gaze fixed on the oncoming line of carriages. "Look at the terrified little men in their corsets." Beverly swallowed. Slowly she turned her head. They passed an open barouche carrying Lord Repton. The older man's jaw was entirely slack, his ruddy face turning a mottled shade of puce as he stared at Alvin's hand covering Beverly's. Alvin didn't look away. He held Repton's stare with a cold, flat expression until the older man awkwardly tipped his hat and hurriedly averted his eyes, pretending to inspect a suddenly fascinating elm tree. A tiny, rough sound escaped Beverly's throat. It took Alvin a second to realize it was a choked, cynical laugh. "He looks like he just swallowed a lemon whole," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly, though not entirely from pain. "He looks like a man who realizes his ledgers are out of order," Alvin replied. The carriage rolled onward, a slow, deliberate march through the gauntlet of London society. The initial shockwave of silence slowly morphed into a frantic whispering. Alvin could practically feel the heat of their stares burning into the side of his face. He felt every imperfection, the slight, jerky sway of Beverly's body as the carriage hit a rut, the stark visibility of her ruined skin in the afternoon light, the heavy, imposing presence she commanded that defied every expectation of a fragile duchess. They were imperfect. They were jagged and broken and terrifying, and they were exactly where they belonged. "Hawkhurst!" A sharp, shrill voice cut through the crunch of the gravel. Alvin signaled the driver to slow the horses. An elegant phaeton pulled alongside them. Inside sat Lady Jersey, a woman whose entire social currency was built on extracting and weaponizing scandal. Her eyes were bright, dark, and utterly predatory. "Alvin, darling," Lady Jersey cooed, leaning dangerously far out of her carriage. Her gaze swept over Beverly with the clinical detachment of a butcher evaluating a strange cut of meat. "We heard the most absurd rumors from the Harrington ball last night. A sudden illness? A ghost in the ballroom? And Caroline has vanished. Do tell me you haven't locked her in a tower." Beverly stiffened. Alvin felt the muscles in her hand bunch up under his glove. This was the test. This was the moment the trap sprang shut. Alvin didn't let go of her hand. He didn't offer a polite, deflected smile. "No tower, Lady Jersey," Alvin said, his voice carrying easily over the noise of the horses. "My cousin found the city air suddenly agreeable to her departure. As for the rumors, I cannot speak to ghosts. I was far too occupied." "Occupied?" Lady Jersey raised a thin, drawn-on eyebrow, her gaze lingering pointedly on Beverly's scar. "Whatever with?" "With my wife," Alvin said. The word felt heavy, solid, and utterly immovable. The Duchess found the country air lacked a certain challenge. She arrived last night to ensure the estate accounts were being managed with the appropriate rigor. Lady Jersey's smile faltered. The predatory gleam in her eye fractured into genuine confusion. She had expected a defensive stutter, a desperate excuse, or at least a flush of humiliation. She had not expected the Duke of Hawkhurst to sit in broad daylight, gripping the cane of a crippled, scarred woman as if it were a scepter. "Accounts," Lady Jersey repeated weakly. "How thrilling." "We find it so," Beverly spoke up. Her voice was flat, deep, and scraped like iron against stone. She turned her head, forcing Lady Jersey to look directly at the full extent of the burn scar. "The Duke is terribly prone to misplacing the winter feed budget. A wife must remain vigilant." Lady Jersey recoiled slightly, her fan fluttering in a frantic, involuntary spasm. "Quite. Well, I must be going." Good day to you both. Well, for her phaeton jerked forward, the driver cracking the whip with unnecessary force. Alvin watched them flee. He let out a long, slow breath, feeling the tension drain out of his shoulders, leaving behind a deep, aching exhaustion. He looked down at their joined hands. The leather of his glove was warm against hers. Winter feed budget? Alvin asked softly. It was the first thing that came to mind, Beverly replied. She slowly pulled her hand free from his grip. Alvin felt a sudden spike of panic, thinking he had pushed too far. But Beverly didn't retreat to the corner of the carriage. She adjusted her grip on the cane, then deliberately rested her shoulder against his. It wasn't a swooning, romantic gesture. It was heavy. It was a practical sharing of weight to ease the grinding ache in her hip. Your left wheel is squeaking, Alvin, she murmured, closing her eyes against the bright sun. The axle needs grease. I will have the groomsmen look at it, he said. See that you do. The vibrations are intolerable. They rode the rest of the way in silence. The stares continued. The whispers followed them. But the venom had been extracted. The aristocracy didn't know what to do with a duke who refused to be ashamed. Without the oxygen of his humiliation, the scandal simply suffocated. When the carriage finally pulled back up to the imposing marble steps of the Hawkhurst townhouse, the afternoon sun had begun to dip, casting long golden shadows across the stone. The footman rushed forward, opening the door and lowering the steps. Alvin stepped out first. The muscles in his legs burned with the lingering fatigue of the previous night. He turned back. Beverly was shifting her weight, preparing for the painful, ugly process of disembarking. She looked exhausted. The defiant energy that had fueled her in the park was draining away, leaving behind the stark reality of her broken body. Alvin did not offer his hand. He did not try to lift her. He planted his boots firmly on the cobblestones. He squared his shoulders, braced his stance, and extended his right forearm, locking it into a solid bar of muscle and bone. Beverly paused at the edge of the carriage. She looked at his arm, then up at his face. There was no pity in his eyes. There was only a quiet, grounded certainty. He wasn't running away. He wasn't looking past her. He was standing right there, in the mud and the light, waiting. She reached out, wrapping her rough, bare fingers tightly around his bicep. She leaned her weight into him. Together, they began the slow, uneven climb up the steps. If this raw, unfiltered story of pride, deep scars, and imperfect redemption struck a chord with you, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button to let us know you want more grounded, sensory-rich historical dramas that ditch the cliches for real human emotion. Share this video with fellow romance lovers who crave protagonists with actual grit, and make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a moment of the scandal. Your support helps us bring more fiercely independent duchesses and reformed dukes right to your screen.